Giselle Hargrove placed the folder on the boardroom table, the way someone drops evidence at a crime scene flat, deliberate, without apology. Her voice carried to every corner of the room, criminal possession and transport of military-grade weaponry, 9 months of federal detention. And you expect me to hand this man the security lead on a $340 million defense contract? Light laughter moved around the table like a quiet current. Caleb Merritt did not move. He did not look down at the folder. He did not offer a single word in his own defense. He simply held Giselle's gaze with the kind of stillness that unsettled people who had never been truly afraid of anything real, because he knew something no one else in that room knew, including Giselle Hargrove herself, that the person about to walk through that door would change everything before the morning was finished. Follow this channel now. This is the kind of story that stays with you long after you stop listening. The alarm on Caleb Merritt's phone went off at 5:45 on a Friday morning, and he silenced it before it could ring a second time. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, 3rd floor, a radiator that clicked in the cold, but it was clean in the way that only single parents who have no margin for chaos learn to keep things clean. He moved through the kitchen quietly, filling a pot with water, setting it on the back burner, pulling a small blue bowl from the cabinet, and setting it on the table with a spoon already inside. Lily appeared in the doorway at 6 to 10, 6 years old, and trailing her stuffed rabbit by one ear. The rabbit's name was Biscuit. It had been white once. Now it was the color of something well-loved, its left ear restitched twice, its button eyes slightly misaligned, in a way that gave it a permanently thoughtful expression. "Are you wearing the nice tie today?" she asked. "I am." Lily considered this with the gravity of someone weighing important intelligence. "The blue one or the gray one?" "The blue one." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and climbed into her chair. She set Biscuit on the table beside her bowl like a second guest at breakfast. Caleb poured the oatmeal, added the blueberries she liked, set the glass of orange juice at exactly the right distance from the edge. The distance she'd knocked it off from twice in the first month after they'd moved in. He had measured it once with his thumb. "Is today important?" Lily asked. Caleb sat down across from her and picked up his own coffee. "Every day is important." She looked at him with the particular look she had, part skepticism, part affection that had been his mother's look, the one he sometimes saw in photographs, and still wasn't entirely prepared for when it appeared in his daughter's face. "You always say that, but sometimes things are more important." He watched her poke at her oatmeal. "Today there's a meeting, with some people at work. Are they nice?" He thought about Adrian Foss. He thought about Giselle Hargrove, whom he had watched from a distance for 8 months, and assessed with the kind of professional detachment that had once kept him alive in places with no exits. "They're serious people," he said. "That's different from nice." Lily seemed to accept this. She spooned oatmeal into her mouth and looked at Biscuit. "Biscuit thinks you'll be fine. Biscuit's very wise." "I know." She said it without irony. Caleb looked at his daughter for a moment, the serious set of her small jaw, the sleep still in the corners of her eyes, the rabbit propped carefully against her glass, and felt the specific weight that had no clean name. Not sadness, not exactly. Something closer to the awareness that this was the only thing that had ever required his full attention and deserved it at the same time. He adjusted his cuffs before leaving the kitchen. The small scar along his left wrist, white and fine, running 2 inches from the base of his palm, caught the morning light the way it always did. He never explained it to anyone. No one had ever asked twice. Vantex's defense systems occupied the top 14 floors of a glass building in the financial district, and its lobby was designed to communicate one thing clearly: scale. The company held contracts with 3 branches of the federal military, employed over 4,000 people across 9 states, and was currently in the final stages of bidding for Project Ironveil, a next-generation battlefield communications encryption platform that the Department of Defense had been quietly circling for 2 years. The contract was worth $340 million over 5 years. It was the largest single contract in Vantex's history, and Giselle Hargrove had built the past 18 months of corporate strategy entirely around winning it. Caleb had been at Vantex for 8 months, brought in as a mid-level systems technician through a standard recruiting channel. He had listed his prior employment as federal contractor, communications infrastructure, and left the specifics deliberately vague. No one had pushed. His technical evaluations were in the 98th percentile for the firm. His colleagues found him competent and quiet. His supervisor had described him in a performance review as the kind of person who finds problems before they become problems. Charlotte Way had noticed him 4 months in, when he flagged a vulnerability in an authentication layer that her own team had signed off on 3 times. She had sat across from him in a small conference room and asked him to walk her through his thinking. He had done so in 12 minutes, using only a whiteboard and a dry erase marker. She had called the head of security that same afternoon. 3 months later, Charlotte had submitted a formal recommendation to the executive team. Caleb Merritt as technical lead for Project Ironvale. Adrian Foss had read that recommendation on a Tuesday morning and set it down on his desk without expression. He was 51, had been Vantex's chief operating officer for 7 years, and operated on the principle that an organization's power structure was a kind of infrastructure it needed maintenance, and unauthorized changes to it caused failures. He had already identified a candidate for the Ironvale lead position. That candidate had worked under him for 4 years and would continue to operate within the structure Adrian had built and maintained. Caleb Merritt was not part of that structure. By Wednesday evening, Adrian had made 2 phone calls. The second one reached a former colleague at a federal personnel review office, not through official channels, but through a lateral connection that had served him before. He had not asked about Caleb's capabilities. He had asked about Caleb's past. By Thursday afternoon, he had a printout. 30 copies of it were already in a manila envelope in his briefcase. Charlotte found Caleb at his workstation at noon on Thursday. She sat down in the empty chair beside him without preamble. "Adrian is asking about you," she said, keeping her voice low. "Not in the way you ask about someone you want to promote." Caleb's hands paused over the keyboard. He didn't turn to look at her right away. "Okay." Charlotte waited. "That's your entire response?" He turned then. His expression was the same as it always was measured, attentive, giving nothing away but also withholding nothing that mattered. "What would you like me to say?" "I'd like you to explain what he might find, so that when I walk into that board meeting tomorrow, I know how much trouble we're in." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Not deciding whether to trust her, he had already assessed that months ago. Deciding something else. "There are things I can't explain," he said. "Not because I don't want to, because I signed documents that mean I don't have the legal standing to explain them." Charlotte stared at him. "That doesn't make me feel better." "I know." He turned back to his screen. "The meeting will go the way it goes, but if you want to do something useful before tomorrow, check the relay encryption nodes on Ironvale's 3rd-tier communication stack." Charlotte frowned. "We reviewed that stack last week. Check the key versioning. The test environment is still running the prototype keys from the first build. Someone didn't update the deployment script when we transitioned to the production architecture." She opened her mouth to say something, then didn't. She looked at him for another moment and left. Caleb did not call anyone that night. He made pasta for Lily, helped her with a worksheet about animals that lived in the ocean, read 2 chapters of a book about a lighthouse keeper who befriended a seal, and turned her light off at 8:30. He sat in the kitchen afterward in the dark for a while. He picked up his phone and scrolled to a number he had not called in 3 years. Commander Jason Holt. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he put the phone face down on the table and went to bed. He was not someone who needed to be saved. That was the thing people never understood. He simply needed the world to keep moving, and for Lily to have breakfast in the morning, and for the relay encryption nodes on Ironvale's 3rd-tier stack to be fixed before Monday. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock Friday morning. Caleb arrived at 8:52, took the elevator to the 22nd floor, and stepped into a hallway where the air tasted faintly of carpet cleaner and expensive restraint. Through the glass panels of the boardroom, he could see 11 chairs arranged around a long oak table. Beside each chair, face down, was a single sheet of paper. He had noticed Adrian in the elevator lobby 20 minutes earlier, speaking quietly with 2 board members. Adrian had stopped speaking when Caleb appeared. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who had already made his calculations and was now simply waiting for the arithmetic to do its work. Charlotte was not in the boardroom. She had not been invited. Caleb sat where he was directed, At the head of the table, Giselle Hargrove arranged a glass of water, a pen, and a legal pad, with the economy of motion that characterized everything she did. She was 33 years old, had run Vantex for 4 years, after purchasing a controlling interest at 29, and had never publicly lost an argument, a contract, or a negotiation. She had a reputation for being fair in the way that a sharp edge is fair, precise, effective, and entirely without mercy if you were on the wrong side of it. She did not look at Caleb when she sat down. Adrian Foss stood at 8:59. Before we address the Iron Vale personnel recommendation, there's a matter the board should have full visibility on. He opened his briefcase and distributed nothing. The papers were already at each seat. I'd ask everyone to review the document in front of them. 11 hands turned over 11 pages. The silence that followed was the specific silence of people processing information that changes the shape of a room. Criminal possession and unauthorized transport of military-grade weapon systems. Federal detention, 9 months, 2019. Released without stated cause. File partially sealed by the Department of Defense. Adrian let the silence breathe. Then, perhaps Mr. Merritt would like to address the board. Giselle picked up the document. She read it twice. She had not seen this before. Her administrative team processed personnel files at the intake stage, and the file that had been submitted for Caleb 8 months ago had passed the standard background threshold. Whatever Adrian had obtained, he had obtained through a channel she had not authorized and would need to examine later. But later was not now. Now there was a document, and it said what it said, and she was sitting in a boardroom with 11 other people and $340 million of contract exposure. She set the paper down flat on the table. "I'm not going to debate technical competence this morning, Mr. Merritt." Her voice was even. It was the voice she used when the decision had already been made, and the conversation was formality. Vantex is in the final stage of a federal defense contract evaluation. We operate under security clearance requirements that are not flexible and are not subject to individual interpretation. A file like this, she touched the corner of the paper without looking at it, doesn't just affect one position. It creates exposure for the entire Iron Vale bid. She looked at him directly for the first time. "I don't know what you told Charlotte Way to earn this recommendation. I imagine you're technically capable. But capability isn't the only variable I'm managing. A beat. I think we all understand that this conversation ends here." There was a sound quiet, brief from 2 seats to Adrian's left. Not quite laughter. The sound of people who have already decided. Caleb had listened to all of it, without changing his expression or his posture. He sat with his hands flat on the table, his shoulders level, his eyes on Giselle Hargrove's face. He had been in rooms where the decision was already made before he walked in. He had been in structures made of concrete and bad intentions with no exit and a deadline measured in minutes. He understood this room. He understood exactly what it was. "You're right about one thing, Miss Hargrove." His voice was quiet, not strained, not performing calm, actually calm. "There is a criminal record with my name on it. I'm not disputing that." He paused. "What you're reading is a redacted document. There are pages behind those pages that your source didn't have access to, or chose not to include." Giselle's expression didn't shift, but something behind her eyes did a fractional adjustment, like a camera recalibrating. "You're not in a position to—" "There's also a more immediate problem," Caleb said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accelerate. Project Iron Vale has a third-tier encryption failure in the relay node architecture. The production stack is still authenticating against prototype keys from the first build. If the Federal Review Board runs their standard penetration protocol on Monday morning, which they will, because it's on the published audit schedule, they'll flag it before your team does. That's not a personnel problem. That's a contract-ending event. The room was quiet, in a different way than it had been before. "I recommend someone check it before this meeting concludes." He picked up his badge from the table. He had set it down when he sat, without explanation, and stood. "I appreciate your time, Miss Hargrove." He walked out of the room. No one stopped him. No one said anything until the door had fully closed. Giselle sat with the document in front of her and looked at the space where Caleb Merritt had been sitting. Something was happening in her thinking that she couldn't fully name yet, the particular discomfort of realizing that a decision that had felt correct 30 seconds ago might not be. Charlotte was in the hallway. She had positioned herself near a window with a tablet she wasn't reading, and when Caleb came through the boardroom door, she straightened. She looked at his face, then at the badge in his hand. "Done?" "Not yet." He handed her the badge. "Pull up the Iron Veil relay stack, the third-tier nodes. Check the key versioning in the deployment configuration file. You said this yesterday. I know. I need you to see it yourself, before someone else does." Charlotte took the badge. "And if it's there?" Caleb was already moving toward the elevator. "Then it's there, and you'll know what to do." He spent the afternoon at Lily's school pickup, then at the grocery store, then in the kitchen making the tomato soup she liked from scratch because he had bought good tomatoes, and there was no particular reason not to. He was rinsing dishes at 4:45 when his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. "Charlotte," he answered. "It's there." Her voice was flat, with the specific flatness of someone standing next to a disaster they can now see clearly. "Exactly where you said. The deployment script never updated. Every authentication request in the production environment is going to a key set that expired 8 months ago. In a live audit, it would show as an unresolved vulnerability at the cryptographic layer. Yes." Silence. "Caleb, the federal review is Monday." "I know. How long have you known about this?" 3 weeks. Another silence. "Longer. Why didn't you?" "Because I was working on the fix. And because Charlotte," he stopped, dried his hands on a dish towel, "I thought I'd have more time before today went the way it did." He could hear her breathing, thinking, "The team can't fix this. I've already asked. Nobody knows this architecture well enough. Not at this level, not in this timeline. I know that too." A pause. Then, quieter. "What do you need?" At 5:15, Giselle Hargrove convened an emergency technical session on the 22nd floor. She had confirmed the vulnerability herself using Charlotte's report, and for approximately 4 minutes, she had sat alone in her office looking at the figures before she had the full shape of it. $340 million, a Monday deadline, and a problem that nobody on her technical staff could solve before then. She looked around the room at 9 engineers, 2 security analysts, and a compliance officer. Who can fix this before Sunday evening? No one raised a hand. 2 people looked at the table. Giselle looked at Charlotte. Charlotte met her gaze steadily. "One person can. He told me about it this morning, before he left the building. He no longer works here. His termination hasn't been formally processed. The paperwork is still on Adrian's desk." Charlotte kept her voice neutral. "But that's beside the point. Miss Hargrove, if Monday comes and the audit team flags this before we do, Iron Veil is over. Not delayed. Over. And it will have been over because the person who found the problem was walked out of this building before he could fix it." Giselle did not respond immediately. She looked at the error report on the screen. She looked at the timeline. She did the calculation that she always did, that she had built her entire career on doing accurately, not the calculation of what was fair or what she preferred, but the calculation of what was true. She stood up. "Everyone take a break. Charlotte, stay." When the room had cleared, Giselle walked to the window and stood with her back to Charlotte for several seconds. Then she turned around. "Get me his number." She made the call herself. No assistant, no intermediary. Caleb answered on the 3rd ring. In the background, Giselle could hear the small ambient sounds of a domestic evening, a chair, something being set on a hard surface, a child's voice asking a question she couldn't fully make out. "Mr. Merritt." She kept her voice level, deliberately level, which was different from naturally level, and she was aware of the distinction even as she made it. "We need you back." A pause. The background sounds shifted slightly. He had moved, or turned away. Then his voice, without heat, without performance. "I'll come in. But there's something I want you to understand first, Miss Hargrove. Go ahead. I'm not doing this to change your opinion of me. I'm not doing it to get the position back, or to demonstrate anything to anyone in that room. I'm doing it because there are people whose safety in the field depends on a communication system that works the way it's supposed to. If that's the reason you're asking me, then we don't have a problem." Giselle held the phone and said nothing for a moment. She had negotiated with senators, federal procurement officers, and 2 former secretaries of defense. She had not often been on the receiving end of a precondition delivered this quietly. "That's the reason," she said. The line was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll be there by 8. He arrived at 8:03. The lobby guard recognized him, had been told by Adrian's office that morning that this individual was no longer cleared for entry, and hesitated visibly before the temporary access card that Charlotte had arranged came through the system. Caleb waited without impatience. He was carrying a laptop bag and a black coffee from the cart outside. He looked like a man who had somewhere to be, and was not particularly interested in anything that stood between him and being there. The server room on the 18th floor was the kind of space that engineers loved and executives avoided: cold, humming, lit with the blue-white light of status indicators, smelling of electrical current and processed air. Charlotte was already there. She had pulled the architecture diagrams and spread them across 2 monitors. She had also made coffee, which Caleb accepted and set beside his laptop without acknowledgement beyond a nod. He opened the deployment configuration. He found what he was looking for in 4 minutes. Then he started working. Charlotte watched him for a while without speaking. He was not particularly dramatic about it. He didn't narrate his process or explain his steps. He simply moved through the system with the specific economy of someone who has spent years making decisions in environments where extra motion was a liability. She had worked with engineers who were faster and engineers who were more thorough, but she had never worked with someone for whom the 2 qualities seemed to occupy the same space so naturally. Adrian Foss appeared in the doorway at 9:30. He looked at Caleb seated at the terminal, at Charlotte beside him, at the open architecture files on the screen. He did not come in. He stood in the doorway for several seconds, and then he left. He didn't say anything, which in some ways communicated more than anything he could have said. Giselle appeared at 11. She stood at the glass panel outside the server room for a long moment before coming in. She had changed out of the formal jacket from the morning meeting and was wearing a dark sweater, which was somehow a more honest version of her, the same precision, but without the armor of ceremony. She watched Caleb work for a moment. "How long?" she asked. 2 more hours, Charlotte said. "Maybe less." Giselle nodded. She started to leave and then turned back. "Charlotte, when you're done, I want a full report on how this was missed by the 3 separate reviews that signed off on the stack." "Yes." Giselle looked at Caleb's back for a moment. He had not turned around. She left. What none of them knew, what Caleb had not told Charlotte and would not tell Giselle that night, was that earlier that Friday afternoon, between the grocery store and the soup, he had sent a text message. It was short, and it was coded in a way that would have been meaningless to anyone who hadn't spent time inside a specific operational structure. It was not a request. It was not a cry for help. It was a report, the kind of report he had filed throughout a decade of work in environments where the cost of not reporting a risk was paid by people who had never asked to be in the line of fire. Commander Jason Holt had received that message at 2:14 on Friday afternoon. He was in Virginia when it came in. He read it once. He read it twice. He opened his laptop and spent 20 minutes reviewing a set of documents that he had not opened in just over 2 years. Then he closed the laptop and drove to the airport. At 11:47 Friday night, a security officer knocked on the server room door. He looked uncomfortable. "There's a man downstairs who doesn't have an appointment and won't give a name." He left this. He held out a folded piece of paper. Charlotte took it and passed it to Caleb. Caleb unfolded the paper and read the 4 words on it. He went very still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of recognition, which is a different and more complete thing. Charlotte watched something move through his expression, not fear, not relief. Something that sat between the two and belonged to a vocabulary she didn't quite have access to. He folded the paper. "Send him up." Jason Holt was 48 years old and had the build of a man who had made a professional commitment to physical difficulty and never renegotiated the terms. He was wearing a gray jacket and dark pants, nothing that identified him on the surface, but he stood in the doorway of the server room with a quality of presence that Charlotte had only encountered a few times in her life, usually in people who had done serious things in serious places and carried the weight of that without advertising it. He looked at Caleb the way you look at someone you have shared genuine danger with. When you see them standing in an ordinary room, doing an ordinary thing. A full accounting, head to foot. Then, "You're thinner. You drove to the airport," Caleb said. "That means you flew commercial, which means you've been planning this since this afternoon. Since 2:17 to be precise." Jason glanced at Charlotte. "Can she hear this?" Caleb looked at her. Charlotte met his eyes and gave him nothing. No pressure, no retreat, just the steady presence of someone who had earned the right to be in the room. "Yes," Caleb said. Jason set a sealed envelope on the desk beside the keyboard. It was thick. Along the top right corner was a stamp in red, 2 lines of text, the upper line redacted in black, the lower line reading, "Partially declassified. Auth. Secant 7, Department of Defense." "I've been carrying these for 2 years, Jason said. "I told myself it was in case something came up, but really a brief pause. The kind of pause a man makes when he's being more honest than usual. I kept them because it didn't sit right." "What happened to you?" "The way it was filed and closed and never corrected." Charlotte looked at the envelope, then at Caleb, then back at the envelope. "What is this?" "This," Jason said, "is the rest of the story." He asked to speak to Giselle Hargrove directly. Charlotte called her. 10 minutes later, Giselle walked into the server room in the same dark sweater, looking at Jason with an expression that was professionally neutral in the way that very composed people are neutral when they are working very hard to remain so. Jason introduced himself, not his name first, but his rank, his unit, and his former operational role, stated in the flat recitative of a man who has long since stopped finding them impressive and uses them now only as coordinates, so that whoever he is speaking to can orient themselves correctly. He opened the envelope. Giselle read. Charlotte read over her shoulder. Caleb did not read. He had been there. The documents were partially declassified, some lines still blacked out, some paragraphs still behind review, but the shape of it was clear. In 2019, a 6-person Special Operations Unit had been inserted into a border region to recover a stolen electronic weapons system that had been taken from a U.S. military installation 7 weeks earlier. The team had separated under contact. Caleb Merritt had continued the mission alone. He had recovered the target asset and extracted it across 2 international border zones under conditions that did not permit the standard documentation of weapons transportation. The criminal charges that had been subsequently filed were administrative cover, a bureaucratic mechanism used when an extraction crosses sovereign boundaries without diplomatic clearance, and the government cannot acknowledge the operation without triggering an international incident. The 9 months of detention were not incarceration in any meaningful sense. They were the required operational debrief and security processing for a mission that had accessed classified systems at the highest level. The file had been sealed not to hide wrongdoing, but to protect an ongoing regional intelligence operation that the asset recovery had made possible. Caleb Merritt had never been guilty of anything except doing something difficult in a place where the rules had temporarily outpaced the reality. Giselle set the last page down. She looked at the table. The server room hummed. Somewhere in the building a heating duct expanded in the cold and clicked once, loudly, and then went quiet. Charlotte spoke first. The sealed portion of the file. That's why the background check cleared. The public record passes the threshold, but there was never enough context to flag it for deeper review. Jason nodded. The portion that Mr. Foss obtained is the only part that's publicly accessible. The part that explains what you're looking at, he tapped the envelope, requires a secretarial-level authorization request, which is not something a COO pulls through an informal contact. Giselle looked up from the table. He accessed restricted federal personnel information through an unauthorized channel? The access log will confirm it. Whoever he used as an intermediary opened a channel that shouldn't have been opened for a civilian personnel inquiry. The department will have questions about that, independently of anything happening in this building. Giselle was quiet. She looked at Caleb. Caleb was leaning against the far wall with his arms loose at his sides, and he was looking back at her with an expression that contained no triumph and no wound, just attention. The attention of someone who has spent years in rooms where the most important thing was to see what was actually there and not what you wanted or feared to see. "This morning," Giselle said. "In the boardroom. You knew all of this." "Yes. Why didn't you?" Because I signed documents in 2019 that specifically prohibit me from disclosing the operational context without written authorization from the Department of Defense. He said it without heat, and because he paused, and when he continued, it was with the particular deliberateness of someone choosing words that are exactly right and nothing extra. If the only way to keep a job is to argue for yourself in a room that is already decided, then I don't want the job that way. Charlotte, who had been listening with her arms crossed, uncrossed them. She said nothing. Jason added quietly, "In 10 years, Merritt never once used what he'd done to get himself preferential treatment. Not once. I've watched people with 1/10 of his record use it to leverage every room they walked into. He never did." Giselle said nothing for a long moment. She looked at the envelope, at the pages spread on the desk beside Caleb's open laptop. The screen showed 3 lines of code, the last changes he had made to the deployment configuration before the conversation had interrupted the work. "Adrian," she said finally. "It wasn't a question. I'll want to speak with him," Jason said. "The department will, formally, next week. But tonight, that's your decision." Giselle was quiet for another moment. Then she straightened, which was the gesture she made, Charlotte had learned, when she had completed a calculation and was ready to act on the result. "Charlotte, get Adrian down here." When Adrian Foss walked into the server room 5 minutes later, he was wearing the expression of a man who has been waiting all evening to hear what version of this night he would have to manage. He saw Jason Holt. He saw the envelope. He saw the partially declassified documents laid out on the desk, like the contents of something that could not be put back. Jason placed a second document beside the first. It was a single page, a communications log, formatted in the dense tabular style of federal record-keeping, time-stamped, annotated in the margins with a notation code that Adrian clearly recognized. "You accessed federal personnel information on Caleb Merritt through a liaison contact who does not have authorization for civilian personnel inquiries," Jason said. He said it with the flatness of someone reading a weather report. The access request was logged. The channel it traveled through was logged. The department has had this since 4:30 this afternoon. Adrian looked at Giselle. Giselle did not look back. In the silence that followed, something in Adrian Foss's face rearranged itself, not into remorse, not into fear exactly, but into the expression of a man who has made a calculation that did not account for certain variables, and who is now standing inside the error. "I'll leave you to think about the specifics," Jason said. "But I'd recommend a conversation with legal counsel before Monday morning." Adrian left the room. No one watched him go. At 2:47 Saturday morning, Caleb Merritt closed his laptop. The deployment configuration was corrected. The production stack was running authenticated against the correct cryptographic keys. Charlotte ran a verification pass twice, called it clean both times, and exhaled in a way she had clearly been holding back for some time. "Monday," she said. "The audit will find nothing." Caleb nodded. He zipped his laptop bag and stood. Giselle had not left the building. She was standing near the door when Caleb straightened, not quite in his way, not quite out of it. In the cold blue light of the server room, without the boardroom table between them, and without the architecture of the morning's meeting arranged around her, she looked less like a CEO and more like a person who had been carrying a heavy object for a long time and had just set it down. "I was wrong this morning," she said. Caleb looked at her. "About what I said. About how I said it. She didn't rush it, didn't qualify it, didn't build a cushion around it. She said it as a fact, because it was one. I made a decision with incomplete information, and I didn't look for the rest of it. That's not how I operate. Or it isn't how I'm supposed to operate." "You operated with what you had," Caleb said. "That's generous. It's accurate." He picked up his laptop bag. "The problem wasn't your judgment, Miss Hargrove. The problem was that someone gave you a partial document and framed it as a complete one." She was quiet. "The Iron Veil lead position is still open. Adrian," she stopped. "Adrian won't be here in the way he has been. The role is there if you want it. Not because you feel like you owe me something." She looked at him directly. "No, because you're the best person for it, and I should have seen that 2 months ago when Charlotte first brought it to me." "A beat. Is that a sufficient reason?" Caleb looked at her for a moment. Something in his face was almost a smile, not quite, but the movement toward one. "I'll think about it." He walked out of the server room, through the hallway, past the elevator, and down the stairs, because he had always preferred the stairs when there was no reason to hurry. Jason was waiting in the lobby. They walked out of the building together into the cold of early Saturday morning, the city making its night sounds around them: trucks, wind, a bus somewhere blocks away. "You could have called me earlier," Jason said. "I didn't need you for me," Caleb said. "I needed you for the file." Jason nodded. He understood. That was the thing about people who had done the same kind of work. They understood the distinction between a situation that required intervention and a situation that simply required the facts to arrive in the right room. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment. "What are you going to do?" Jason asked. "Get some sleep. Pick up my daughter. Make breakfast." Jason looked at him. "And the position?" Caleb turned up the collar of his coat. "I told her I'd think about it." He took the subway home. Lily was at Mrs. Gibson's, the 70-year-old neighbor who kept a tin of butter cookies on her kitchen counter and had never once in 8 months asked Caleb a question about where he worked or what he'd done before, which he appreciated more than he would ever say directly. He picked Lily up at 7 in the morning, and she came running down the hallway in her socks with Biscuit's arm in her fist. She crashed into him at full speed, arms around his neck, and he caught her the way he always did, without bracing, without hesitation, as if catching her was the thing his body had been built for, and everything else had been supplementary. "You're back," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. "I'm back." She leaned away to look at his face the way she always did, reading it with the accuracy that children develop when they have only one parent to read. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay." She considered this verdict. Then she held up Biscuit. "Biscuit missed you." Caleb looked at the rabbit, the restitched ear, the misaligned button eyes, the particular kind of worn that only comes from being held without reservation, over and over, for years. "I missed Biscuit too," he said. He carried her home. She fell back asleep on the walk, her head against his shoulder and Biscuit dangling from her hand, and he moved carefully so as not to wake her, which was the particular consideration of a parent in the specific piece of a morning that has come out the other side of something. On Monday at 10:13, the Federal Review Board completed its standard penetration audit on Project Iron Veil's communication architecture and filed an initial assessment. No critical vulnerabilities were detected. The cryptographic authentication layer passed at the highest certification tier. The board's preliminary evaluation recommended Iron Veil for advancement to the final contract award phase. Charlotte forwarded the summary to Caleb with a message. "Check your Vantex email." He opened it on his phone at the kitchen table, while Lily drew rabbits on a sheet of paper. She was going through a phase of drawing nothing but rabbits, in different sizes and different colors, an entire population of rabbits, spreading slowly across a growing pile of paper in the corner of the living room. The email was from Giselle Hargrove. It had been sent from her personal address, not her Vantex account. There was no corporate signature block, no formal header, no assistant's courtesy note in the subject line. It was 3 sentences. "The position is still open. I'm offering it because you're the right person for it and the project needs you. The decision is yours, and I'll respect it either way." Caleb read it once. He set the phone face down on the table. He looked out the window at the street below the morning light on the sidewalk. A man walking a dog, 2 pigeons on a window ledge across the way, doing the specific thing that pigeons do that looks like a conversation. He thought about what the position would mean, what it would require, what Iron Veil was, under the technical specifications and the contract value and the meetings and the boardrooms. It was a communication system that people in the field would depend on to stay connected when the margin for error was measured in seconds. He had known that from the moment he'd seen the architecture diagram, which was part of why he had taken the mid-level job at Vantex in the first place, which was not something he had explained to Charlotte or anyone else. He picked the phone back up. He typed 2 sentences. "I'll take the meeting. Thursday works if that works for you." He sent it. Closed the email. Set the phone down again. Lily looked up from her drawing. "Bah, look. This one has a blue hat." He looked at the rabbit on the paper, lopsided, earnest, genuinely wearing a hat. "That's very distinguished," he said. "What's distinguished?" "It means the hat makes him look important." Lily considered the rabbit. "He's important without the hat," she said, with the certainty of someone who has thought about this already and arrived at a conclusion that doesn't require revision. Caleb looked at his daughter. He thought about a boardroom on the 22nd floor, about a folder placed on a table like a verdict, about 11 faces turned toward him, waiting for him to flinch or fold or fill the silence with something they could use against him. He thought about the look on Giselle Hargrove's face in a server room at 2 a.m. when she had said, without decoration, that she had been wrong. He thought about how nothing that had happened in the past 48 hours had changed who he was. Not the humiliation, and not the vindication, not the folder on the table, and not the documents in the envelope. He had walked into that room the same person he walked out of it, which was the only thing that had ever been fully within his control and the only thing, in the end, that had mattered. Outside, the city moved the way cities move, without waiting, without noticing, without particular interest in any single person's crisis or resolution. The pigeons shifted on the window ledge across the street. The light changed. A bus went by. Caleb poured a second cup of coffee, sat down beside his daughter, and watched her give another rabbit a hat. For the first time in a long time, he had nothing left to prove, and the quiet that lived inside that fact was the best thing in the room.